Greetings, students. This is the fifth and final set of notes in the Freshwater Resources Unit. It is called ES 8.5 Water Pollution. Just like with all the notes for this video, you should be writing down everything that is in orange text. If you feel I'm moving too fast, please pause the video. And at the end, there is a slide with everything on it that you should have written down. Pollution. Geological processes, such as erosion, and human activities, such as waste disposal, can impact water supplies. Here are a few examples of ways that water can be polluted: volcanic activity, sedimentation, acid rain, runoff, farming, and waste disposal. Here's a picture of a farm and water running through it, and you can bet that that water is carrying some things with it to a nearby lake or river, including whatever's been sprayed on those vegetables. Point source pollution. Water always flows downhill. Pollution originating in one location can affect a body of water downstream. Pollution from one particular place, like a factory, is called point source pollution. It is point source pollution if you can pinpoint the source of exactly where the pollution is coming from. So if there's a pipe with pollution inside of it, and you can say the pollution is coming from that pipe, it's point source pollution. Examples of point source pollution include wastewater treatment plants, chemical factories, power plants, including coal ash. We'll talk more about coal ash. Non-point source pollution. That's when the same type of pollution is coming from many different sources. There's lots of stuff in a watershed, lots of sources, and sometimes you can't exactly pinpoint where pollution's coming from. Examples of non-point source pollution include sediment from construction, toxic chemicals from energy production, antibacterial soap, oil from urban runoff, salt from mining, and fertilizers and insecticides from agriculture. What is coal ash? Many of our power plants in Virginia and everywhere burn coal to produce energy. A byproduct of this coal-fueled power production is coal ash. Coal ash is what's left over after the coal has been burned for energy. Imagine what is left over after a campfire or at the bottom of a grill. There's a big mountain of coal ash somewhere in Virginia. And here's what it looks like when it gets into the water. There has been some controversy about how to store coal ash safely because it doesn't go away. Right now, Virginia lets Dominion store its coal ash in giant pits filled with water, and they are also allowed to slowly put it in the river. The locations where Dominion is releasing coal ash effluent into the James River is a point source of pollution. Also, if there is a big storm, it can damage the coal ash storage units and release a lot of bad things into the river all at once. This photograph is from an event like that happened in North Carolina, where some coal ash pits were breached during a storm. This is what a coal ash pit looks like from the air. Another type of pollution is called eutrophication. There are many farms in Virginia, and they all use fertilizer on their crops. That fertilizer runs off into rivers and streams and accumulates. The fertilizers work on plants because they contain nitrogen and phosphorus. Those are the nutrients that all plants need to grow. In large quantities, these nutrients, mostly sourced from livestock poop, build up in bodies of water and stimulate algal growth. So algae is like single-celled photosynthetic organisms in the water, and if you're adding fertilizer to the water, they grow out of control sometimes. That's called an algal bloom. When algae blooms, it can take over and cause problems for the ecosystem and for people who might be drinking the water. Sometimes there's something called a dead zone. A dead zone happens when algae take up all of the oxygen and the fish suffocate and die. Some algae are also toxic and release poison into the water that can harm wildlife or humans. This is a picture of a fish kill. A bunch of fish all die at once because the algae has sucked all the oxygen out of the water because there's so much of it. We've looked at this picture before. This isn't related to eutrophication, but this is the Cuyahoga River on fire in 1969. Environmental legislation. In the United States, pollution was really bad throughout most of the 20th century. Citizens and legislators really started to take notice after several rivers caught on fire. President Nixon established the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, in 1970. Some landmark legislation that improved the environment was the Clean Air Act in 1963, the National Environmental Policy Act in 1969, the Clean Water Act in 1972, and then CERCLA in 1980, which designates certain sites as Superfund. If it's a Superfund site, that means it's extremely polluted. Here's a cartoon. President Trump famously repealed some rules about what could be put into bodies of water. DDT. DDT stands for dichloro diphenyl trichloroethane. So DDT is a little easier to say. It's a pesticide that was developed in the 1940s. It's great at killing insects, but it got into the water supply and people realized it was also killing birds. Once it gets into an ecosystem, it takes a really long time to go away. In part, this is due to bioaccumulation. That's when harmful effects magnify up the food web. DDT is known as a possible carcinogen, and it's considered a persistent organic pollutant, or POP. It was banned in 1972. But between the 40s and 72, they were spraying this stuff like wild. Just driving through neighborhoods, spraying it on people. Craziness. And it's one of the reasons why during the 70s and 80s and 90s, there were much fewer large predator birds like the bald eagle around in Virginia, but they've made a comeback recently. So in the 30s, there were 600 to 800 breeding pairs of bald eagles found in the Chesapeake Bay. The pesticide DDT comes into widespread use in the 1940s. In 1959, DDT uses peaks with nearly 80 million pounds applied. In the 1970s, there were only 60 breeding pairs of bald eagles found on the bay. And then in 1972, the US banned most of the applications of DDT. In 2001, you had 600 breeding pairs of bald eagles found on the bay. And in 2016, now there's 2,000 pairs of bald eagles found on the bay. Pollution in a watershed. Just about everyone lives in a watershed, and some people live downstream from others. The actions of the people who live upstream can have impacts on the water that affects the people living downstream. For example, if a chemical plant in Pennsylvania is polluting the Susquehanna River, and all of that pollution eventually ends up in the Chesapeake Bay, Maryland, Virginia might be the ones cleaning it up, because we've got the bay. So what happens upstream affects us downstream. And Virginia, Delaware, New Jersey, Maryland, West Virginia, New York, Pennsylvania, they all have their own laws and rules about what can be put into a river, but it all ends up in the same place. The Flint water crisis. So we looked at this a little bit recently in class. In 2014, the city of Flint, Michigan changed their drinking water source from Lake Huron to the Flint River. A slight change in water pH and chloride levels resulted in the corrosion of old lead pipes. This meant lead was added to the drinking water. Heavy metals in your drinking water can be very harmful to human health and cause developmental issues in children. Even though the smell and appearance of the water had changed, city officials assured the residents that the water was safe to drink. And then people started getting sick. A few people died. And then for a long time in Flint, they were only drinking bottled water. Sediment as a pollutant. Sediment is a natural part of a river system, but the actions of humans can cause over-sedimentation of a watershed. You can see in this picture all of that sediment. That's the Susquehanna River coming down to the Chesapeake Bay, visible from outer space. Sediment carried by a river blocks sunlight and can stunt growth of primary producers like algae. When the base of the food web is harmed, that causes negative health impacts for many organisms. So every river has a food web inside of it, and it depends on the plant life to support it. And if you have a bunch of dirt floating in the water, it blocks sunlight, which stunts the growth. Who owns the water? Many companies bottle water and sell it, but where does that water come from? Nestle is one of the world's largest bottled water producers, and they source water from a spring in Southern California, a region which has faced recent historic drought. And some people are kind of upset that there's water shortages in their area, but for some reason Nestle is allowed to take that water away and sell it. Nestle has faced public backlash over this, but the law says they can use the water because they own the land where the spring is. But who owns the water? All right, that's it for the pollution notes. Here is the page that has everything you need to have written down.